Yay, okay. Got it. Technology. This is all very new to us and, well, maybe everybody here. So figuring it out together. But thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. For anyone watching or listening, welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. This is our second live stream on KUMU. So we just appreciate everybody for joining. We have some amazing panelists here with us today. We'll start off with some intros. Dr. Robyn, why don't you go ahead and kick us off, please?
Hi. Hi, everyone. So I'm Robyn Rodriguez. I am a professor of Asian American Studies at UC Davis, as well as the founding director for the Bulasan Center for Filipino Studies. So kind of in terms of my scholar researcher identity, I've written pretty extensively on the Filipino experience, as well as the Asian American experience more broadly. Just came out with a book in January that I co-edited with my former mentor, now collaborator, Dr. Diane Fujino, on Asian American activism. And then in August last year, so just about 6 months before that book, I had another book on the Asian American experience. So that's sort of my scholar hat. I'm also very much a community organizer. I've worked in lots and lots of different spaces. The space I'm doing a lot of work in right now is as the interim board chair for the Asian American Liberation Network in the greater Sacramento region. But I'm also transitioning. I am planning on doing my research and writing and teaching outside of the university on a new farm that I bought with my husband, where we hope to be able to host actually more wellness and healing spaces like this in person, as well as to offer a whole variety of learning experiences for folks. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to share some of my insights on this platform. Thank you.
Sorry, it's so hard to unmute on this. It's so small. Dr. Catherine?
Hi, that's an impressive resume, Dr. Robyn. I don't know if I can follow that. I'm much more new to the field, but hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Catherine Teotico. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Counseling and Psychological Services, and currently is the 2021 to 2023 Leadership Fellow for the Asian American Psychological Association. A lot of my clinical work is working with Asian Americans. I work primarily with the undocumented scholars in particular. But have ran a host of number of group therapies focused on Asian American wellness and well-being, and then transnational identities as well. But I'm very honored to be here and look forward to our discussion.
All right, and then best for last. Just kidding. Dr. Oh my gosh. Dr. Daniel.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually not a doctor. DR are my initials. But I'm glad to be with two amazing doctors here. My name is Daniel Domaguin. You see him pronouns. I am originally from KUMU territory, South San Diego, California. Currently reside on unceded Nisenan territory, greater Sacramento area. And my family is from the Ilocos region, Ilocos Sur, La Union, and most recently from Nisenan. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, currently serving in private practice with both employee assistance programs, queer and trans folks of color, and tribal clinic consumers. I spent the most of my time in the last few years serving tribal and urban Native American communities across the state of California, but have been a therapist for 7-ish years throughout the state. And yeah, excited to be here.
Amazing. Thank you for those intros. I am Monica. Pronouns are she, her. based in Grand Rapids, and I serve as Director of Operations for FilExcellence. Gian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. My name is Gian. She, her pronouns. I am based in Denver, Colorado. I work in tech and do social media as well. Nice meeting everybody. And I am the Director of Communications at FilExcellence.
Okay, so just to kick us off, our Wellness Wednesday topic this week is colonization and its impact on our mental health today. So just a very broad question to start with. How would you define colonial mentality? Let's just start with the order that you introduced yourself in.
Sure. Hi. I'm going to kind of approach this as from a Filipinx studies scholar perspective, but also, I'm not a psychologist by training. Neither am I a clinician, right? So there are really great scholars, and I'm sure Dr. Catherine can also kind of share some of that work. People best known or associated with kind of studying kind of colonial mentality in the Filipino community might be, for example, E.J.R. David. Folks who look at Filipino American psychology, like Kevin Nadal, who are very, very active on social media also. So I'm sure that you can get some of their insights. So I'm going to come at it from a very different lens, especially because I'm a sociologist. So I look at things less in the ways that colonial mentality might manifest individually, but kind of looking at the kinds of structures that kind of create colonial mentality to begin with. That's sort of something that we do. But maybe before I go on, I mean, there are lots of ways that colonial mentality might manifest. Certainly kind of in the Bulasan Center and in the School for Liberating Education that I've launched, we've had lots of people come on who've talked about the various ways that colonial mentality might manifest. For example, there is a Dr. Joanne Rondelia who talks about colorism in the Filipino community. So the ways in which we divide people up and create a hierarchy around skin color. Of course, with the browner that you are, the ways in which you're kind of on the lower end of the hierarchy, and how that is propagated by an industry that includes, for example, the cosmetics industry is very implicated in this. For many people who go to the Philippines or visit the Philippines might see the proliferation of skin brightening or skin whitening products that kind of speaks to kind of the deep ways that we kind of internalize colonialism or colonial standards of beauty, even in the homeland, and certainly growing up in white settler countries like the United States or Canada or Australia. We know that living in these white settler, white supremacist countries, there is a privileging of light skin that also kind of adds on to kind of our longer history of colonialism. That's one kind of manifestation of colonial mentality, and certainly it really causes a lot of distress, especially for women, very, very gendered, the way that colorism, for instance, might manifest. So it's something that can be very triggering for young women. And, it doesn't even end at just the color of our skin. It can be the contour of our nose. It could be the shape of our face. It could be the texture of our hair, our bodies. Are they thin? Are they not? And all of that having deep impacts about how Filipino women might see themselves. And I'm also part of a space with podcaster Crystal Fabella, who does Filipinas on the Rise. And she also kind of helps lead out a group called the Filipinas Soul Sisterhood Circle. And that's come up multiple times, just so much of the trauma that comes with that kind of manifestation. But I feel like those are things that are sort of easier to see. I think some of the deeper ways that kind of that often escape view, for example, is just, even the way that we embrace in the U.S. context the model minority myth that's often applied to Asian Americans more broadly. That idea that Asians are, are sort of always already highly successful, and all of that. That can also, I think, can be a way of thinking about colonial mentality as well. I think it's really important to kind of see that colonial mentality is deeply rooted in kind of U.S. culture. It for Filipinos in particular, we are impacted by it already in the Philippines. And then when you, if you migrate or you're part of the broader diaspora, especially in countries like the U.S., that's exacerbated and worsened by just living in this context. Things like the model minority myth, among other kinds of things. And that gets reproduced in multiple ways, right? In the education system here and there, in clearly in the media and representations of Asian Americans, so many other ways. But I think I'll defer to Daniel and Dr. Catherine to speak kind of more clinically maybe about what colonial mentality might look like. But just a few examples, just sort of from my vantage point, sort of in my work with the Bulasan Center, and as a scholar in Filipinic studies and Asian American studies.
Well, I'll just add to that. That was a very comprehensive background that Dr. Robyn talked about. But, quite simply put, colonial mentality is the internalized oppression and feeling of inferiority that stems from years of our colonizers just telling us that we are savages or need to be subjugated, and that's why they're coming in. And they've infuse this in our mindset to justify them taking over, to be able to take our resources and make us feel like we're indebted to them all this time. And unfortunately, what's happened over time is it becomes part of our unconscious now, where we aren't even aware until we have little moments. I'll share my own personal experience. For years and years, family members told me, I need to straighten my hair. That was kind of the standard of beauty that we had to live by. And it was only years later, and even I'll be fairly honest, my development into it was much later in the pandemic, where there was no access to the salon, where I refound my heritage and I found the ways in which there's beauty in our curly hair. There's beauty in the color of my skin and my nose and all of that stuff. And that's so not in my consciousness or presence, even if I told myself, hey, I'm super proud of being Filipino. I love Filipino things and products and all of those things, but it doesn't come to light until you take a pause and kind of take a step back. And when you see that, and I work primarily a lot with Asian Americans, and you see that and you kind of question, like, where are these belief systems coming from? For a lot of them, they don't even know where it's coming from. It's just inherent that we're supposed to want Western things. We're supposed to want to be American. And what inevitably happens is our self-esteem gets crushed in a lot of ways, and we're told we don't belong in this space and we need to quiet our voices and we need to not take up space because we should be somehow grateful for the influences of Americans or even the Spanish from there on. And this colonial mentality not only affects, as Dr. Robyn said, like the preference of our skin or the products that we buy, but it interacts with the ways we create relationships with other Filipinos. We've all kind of heard the idea of crab mentality, unfortunately. And I've actually had less of that coming into the United States, where other Filipinos were like, we're here, we're seen as the minority, let's build each other up. But it also very much affects how we view ourselves. And I know we'll get into a much deeper discussion about this, but it perpetuates depression, anxiety of, do we belong in these spaces? And is my life inherent and has dignity, right? And so I can go on and on about this, but I'll defer to Daniel.
Echoing what you both, all of the above, and kind of going with that idea.
Daniel, we're having a hard time hearing you. I think you're cutting off a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It is 100 and something degrees in SAC, so my phone's probably overheating. You can blame climate change for that. So, echoed everything that Dr. Rod and Kat said, but going along with that idea of inherent, like colonial mentality being inherent, it is something that was kind of passed on. Many of our ancestors had to survive by kind of doing these things that were if we don't listen to what we're being told to do by the colonizers, then we might die. And this is something that some people, it was survival in certain ways. But at the same time, like that survival was putting down ourselves. So we had to hide who we were in many ways, our cultures, our traditions, as there was mixing a race, like even hiding that you're even Filipino. So that's something that kind of continued on. And that's where that idea that lighter skin, straighter hair started to become the standard, right? We followed the Western beauty standards. And as a dark skinned, and you can't tell right now, but curly haired Filipino man, I grew up in a community where I didn't get to be accepted as a Filipino person, even though I very much am, because I didn't meet those Western beauty standards that have become part of the ways in which a lot of our folks think. And then kind of going along with what Dr. Rod said regarding the embrace of that model minority myth, expanding upon that, the embrace of Western ideals, period, the embrace of higher education, of certain types of jobs. What do you mean you're going to be a social worker? Why aren't you going to be a nurse or a doctor or one of these things? Even though traditionally me as a healer would be seen as something that is, important and honorable and helping of the community, that individualistic way of looking at things in the West became part of that colonial mentality. So things like Nawa, which I guess Tagalog is Bayanihan, that whole, helping each other out, we have gone away from that and focus on the individualistic part of what Western society has taught us. And that is also part of that colonial mentality.
Thank you for that. That's such a loaded question. So I appreciate each of your feedback and responses to that. I'm just curious for each of you, because Dr. Catherine mentioned it was more recent that you kind of have discovered and started to unlearn colonial mentality with yourself. But I'm kind of curious about your own experiences with it in your own lives. Because of course you are, mental health professionals and you're actively doing the work and helping other people. But I'm also curious about yourselves too and your own experiences, if you are willing to share.
Oops. Oh, sorry. I pressed the wrong thing. I mean, I don't mind sharing at all. Gosh, that's hard. I feel like it's actually a constant work, actually, to notice the ways that colonial mentality is impacting, my life. Even though, although I wouldn't say that I'm a mental health professional. I'm more of a scholar and researcher, a community organizer, but definitely it's a constant work. Because I could just give a recent example. So I'm a mother of a 6-year-old child, and I struggle all the time with whether or not I'm exerting too much pressure on him with respect to academics, or whether or not I'm doing enough when it comes to kind of supplying him with or enrolling him in formal sort of extracurricular activities, right? That may not on the surface look like model minority myth, may not look like colonial mentality, but if we take the definition that Daniel offered, which I think is great, which is these Western values, these notions of what matters and what counts, then I can look at that. It becomes much more than a simple parenting dilemma, but it is about a dilemma related to, what kind of values am I trying to inculcate in my child, right? Does it matter that, or do I value only, whether he's, achieving XYZ kind of in language arts and math and etc. Do I not value the fact that maybe he has a highly developed emotional intelligence, that he's incredibly creative, or, and these are the ways in which kind of I think Western values are so deeply embedded, and they constantly, and it's hard, right? I mean, it's a constant battle, because you're inundated, with all sorts of messages all the time about what is appropriate. And this is just in the realm of parenting, right? I mean, then there's just, as I look at myself in the mirror and I'm trying to, struggle with, aging and the ways in which we devalue, also partly part of a deeply colonial construct and Western construct about how we think about women, women as they age, how we devalue that. And so it's constant. It's a constant work, and so healing from it is a constant work, and so important to invest in, because we're not living outside of it, and we have to constantly cultivate these spaces where we can orient ourselves around a different set of values, around a different set of meanings, things that are meaningful to us. So yeah.
And to add on to what I was saying earlier, I think what's hard about something that's internalized is it's kind of like when you're driving a car, you don't know where the blind spot is, right? You see it only if there's like an accident happening or something comes to your attention, and it's like, oh, here it is. And like I said, hair is one of them. Another example of it is I went back to the Philippines with my partner who isn't Filipino. And my cousins are kind of making fun of the fact that my Tagalog is awful now. And I wondered for a moment of like, why is my Tagalog awful? And I remember very distinctively, I love my mother and I love my parents, and they, always prize education. But I remember when I was younger, my mom said, we picked this particular school in Manila because they only taught 2 classes in Tagalog and the rest was in English. So we knew that your English was going to be better. And now it's kind of like that opposite of like, why can't you speak in Tagalog in this particular way? And it's passed down, actually, as Daniel was saying, from these generations of grandparents saying like, oh, it's praising me for talking in English from a very, very young age, and then losing my own language and my connection to the community, right? And so it is this constant learning process, and you only get glimpses of it when there's these critical moments that come up. Another critical moment, like to speak to parenting, my niece was just born, and I asked my brothers and my sisters, I was like, oh, are you going to teach them Tagalog? And they're like, no, we'll do that later. We'll teach them English first, right? And we see that again, that prizing of, we need to put in the Western value first. Then we do the Filipino as like an extra thing, and not this kind of joining of both the pride of the Filipino heritage and also the American heritage together, and growing in that and having a symbiotic relationship with that. And then we end up wondering now why several generations, these Gen Zs, don't know how to speak Tagalog, right? So it's just those little moments, and it takes time for us to kind of recognize those. I think you muted yourself.
Okay. I have really big fingers too. So loving my big fingers, it's part of my heritage. What you were saying about language, Dr. Kat, the last time we went back to the Philippines, we had a family like reunion thing, and they were all speaking Ilocano, and I went up to my mom and I was like, she was saying, oh, they want you to talk. I'm like, I don't speak Ilocano. How do you expect me to talk to like 40 people if I can't speak? And then I kind of got mad and I was like, this is your fault. Which it was hot. I wasn't in the best mind space. But then afterwards we were talking and she was like, this is what I thought was right. We thought this is how we were supposed to do it. So that idea, again, of survival and the insidiousness of colonial mentality is this is, again, the way we survived, and this is what we thought we needed to do in order for us to continue on as people. And if that meant you needing to learn English and you becoming a doctor or something like that, then that's what we did. So just like you did, we told our my niece and nephew, their grandparents, my aunts and uncles, you're going to teach them Ilocano and Tagalog. And then they were like, oh no, they're going to get confused and then drop some knowledge like, no, that actually is going to help them understand and comprehend things better and faster if they have multiple languages. So my nieces and nephews, they're English mostly, but then know tidbits of Tagalog and Ilocano and Spanish because they're in South San Diego. So their processing is better, their understanding, and they're able to kind of speak with us in those things and those languages. But another thing that I was thinking about, I mentioned being dark skinned and curly haired. My mom and all the aunties and grandmas, pushing Escanol and papaya soap and all of those things. And obviously didn't work, which I'm proud of and happy about. But it was like, this is what I was told. So why question that? So it's not until we kind of dig and like under the surface and go, okay, what's the reason that we are doing these things and why have we been doing it for, in some cases, decades, in some cases, centuries, that we kind of find, okay, there's reasons behind this and ways in which we could move in a different direction.
I just wanted to add on to that, if that's okay, especially with what Dr. Kat had said, and also Daniel, how we were raised to assimilate for so long, speaking English with straightening the hair and all of that. And then all of a sudden, once we're adults, we find ourselves kind of lost almost and needing this sense of belonging. But it's hard, especially for the people in the diaspora, because, when you end up not being able to speak Tagalog and then you go back to the homeland, all of a sudden you're not Filipino enough because you don't know the language, or you might not be familiar with the culture. You didn't embrace it fully because you're so busy trying to fit in to be American. And so I feel like it's a constant. That colonial mentality has definitely contributed to that confusion and that identity. I don't want to call it identity crisis, but it's kind of like, where do I belong? How do I figure out, can I embrace both, while also working on the breaking and healing that colonial mentality.
Oh, now I'm having trouble trying to unmute. I was Matt's next to me, and I was just saying I would call it an identity crisis, at least for me when I was growing up, and still now as I try to navigate and reconnect to my Filipino-ness. And I mean, I've said this before, but FilExcellence has played a huge role in that, at least in my own journey, and I'm really grateful for that. I wanted to ask a light-ish question as a follow-up because intergenerational trauma was brought up. Have any of you watched the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once? And I would love to kind of learn your thoughts on that, on the movie and its portrayal of, trauma, intergenerational trauma.
It was great. Y'all should watch it. If it doesn't get all the Oscars, I'm going to be incredibly mad. So it's been a while since I've watched it. It did portray this like intergenerational transmission of trauma. So trauma can be passed in multiple ways. It can be passed through our genes within the womb. It could also be passed on by how we're raised and what's in the environment. So if our parent learned that you must do these things and you must act in this way, then that kind of trauma response is then passed on by those parents to those children. So that is seen in the movie, and I don't want to give anything away, but that is seen. And then it's immigrants from China to Anglophone North America. I think they're in the US, and the ways in which the daughter is kind of rebelling against that colonial mentality, but also trying to keep that connection with her family, specifically her mother. And that's also one of the insidious things about colonial mentality and being second gen, being part of the diaspora, is how do I keep my connection without disavowing my connection? How do I break free from colonial mentality without breaking free from my family? And that's a very complicated thing. And the movie does a great job of kind of exploring how that could be explored in the multiverse, right? There's all these different ways in which we can make decisions, and those decisions impact what our lives look like. So some of us on here might not be speaking with some of our parents, grandparents, other relatives who hold different ideals than we are trying to hold. And that is sometimes part of the journey. So that's kind of straying away, but you know, part of how we heal from trauma is also making those boundaries and then learning how to kind of synthesize afterwards when multiple sides are ready to kind of have that conversation and heal together.
If it's okay to add, I didn't actually get a chance to watch it yet. I can't wait to. But one thing I wanted to share, and this is a great insight that she was a former student, now colleague, Dr. Valerie Francisco, had shared. And she talks about how it's really important for us to not just talk about intergenerational trauma, but I think she kind of calls it either intergenerational resilience or intergenerational resistance. And I love that framing because I think that it's also important for us to really lift up the fact that, that look at where we are, that we can actually come together in a space just like this, in the face of everything, in the face of centuries of colonization, in the face of being displaced into the diaspora, in the face of white supremacy and all these institutions that all day, every day, right? And there should be that all day, every day, reproducing over and over again ideas that actually so deeply devalue who we are and where we come from, that we can, despite all that, come to a place like this where we can kind of reclaim our Filipino-ness, reimagine it in many other ways. I think that that's really amazing, and we need to also hold on to all of that. It's super important for us to, I think, there's a lot of conversation now about intergenerational trauma and important conversations that need to be had. But it's so equally important to lift up, again, I don't know how she framed it, whether it was intergenerational resistance or resilience, but that, being important. But it also means that, recognizing that, how we are finding our way to being Filipino means though that we're also reimagining Filipino too, which is also okay. And I think sometimes that causes some anxiety in some folks who want to kind of hold on to some authentic thing that is Filipino that is kind of impossible anyhow. And it's also maybe not helpful to kind of police the boundaries of what is Filipino and instead kind of create as much as possible, as much space and in this, and this, for example, comes up with like the whole debate sometimes around Filipinx, right? Where folks kind of feel like, well, that's not really authentically Filipino. I mean, I feel like I've gotten that a lot, especially from folks in the Philippines. But I think, I always try to counter that with, you have to recognize how, this is actually kind of a reclamation of being Filipino in a new kind of way. And that culture is constantly shifting, that we can hold on to that thing, that core of being Filipino is so important, and we should celebrate that.
Gian, were you gonna say something?
Oh no.
Oh, sorry.
I was trying to
I see
record.
someone's like hand go towards the button. Okay. I really love that, Dr. Robyn. I think I needed to hear that too. Just as we evolve, obviously, the normal is always going to be changing, and to own that. I guess as a follow up, how can we start healing the inner, like, generational wounds caused by colonialism, um, and create access to more people for to create that safe space for people, just because we know that therapy is not very accessible, and there are very limited mental health professionals that are Filipino. So I guess what can we do to actively heal, and embrace the intergenerational strength in our community?
Dr. Catherine, if you want to start.
Sure. I love this question because there's a variety of different ways to do this. I think one of the biggest things, at least for me, I'll start with my own personal journey, is finding pride in our community. And I specifically made the intention today to wear everything Filipino, which is like, I got this from when I was in the Philippines, and it was created by the Taboli tribe in Mindanao, and then got this from like a Filipino creator. Her company is Sunkist Panay, right? And it's this constant holding of like, how can I continue to infuse my community into all of this, right? When there's a society constantly telling us that the prideful thing is to buy everything Western, is to like get all the designer things in Western. Like, how can I take pride in the community in which I grew up in, and share the spotlight with that? And I also love that we're doing this, as we're saying, with Philippine excellence, right? We're showing this and we're sharing this experience, but it's also, in a therapeutic sort of way. And I think I'll speak for therapists as well, is that we also need to be a part of that community. Part of the work is to create trust within the community and to say, like, we understand psychology was created by old white men in like the 18th century, right? It needs to evolve, it needs to change with the needs of the people that we're trying to see. And that takes on our work as psychologists to be able to say, like, how can we adapt therapy for you, right? And I think it also requires, like, one of my favorite traditions in Filipino culture is our oral tradition. We were speaking about intergenerational strength, and I remember I was on a Zoom call with my grandmother during Zoom, the pandemic era. And I was like, hey, Lola, I'm so worried about you, like staying at home, cooped up in your apartment. And she said something that I'll never forget. She goes, Catherine, I have not been allowed to go to high school because the Japanese took over. And I wasn't allowed to go to school for 4 years. And there was bombing there, and we connected as a family. And this pandemic where I just have to sit at home and watch TV, where I'm not worried about my life, this is nothing. This allows me to connect with my grandkids on Zoom that I haven't connected in a really long time. And it speaks to this importance of telling our story. And if therapy in itself can feel like just a place to share our story, to share our resilience, to share our pride in our community, that can be in a way healing. And it doesn't have to have that same framework as here's a Western kind of product that we're trying to fit in for a model minority piece of it, right? And so I think there's work from our side as psychologists, making it more accessible to Filipinos, but it's also on the other side, like being able to talk to our parents. My parents are very like traditional in terms of like they wanted to be a medical doctor, and I was kind of like, hey, I'm going to be a psychologist, and they're like, what? They're like, depression doesn't exist, and I was like, hold on. Like, let's unpack this. Let's have that, like really hard conversation about what depression is and what can look like. And it doesn't have to be this just white idea of what depression is. And I really got them to turn around, especially during this pandemic, and seeing our entire community, which a lot of Filipinos are in the healthcare system. We're having a really, really difficult time with this onslaught of COVID over and over. And we were just supposed to be resilient, right? And we could see us breaking down and the burnout, and being able to speak to my parents and say, that is the thing I want to work on. And that is the thing that I want us as a community in psychology to find peace, that we can talk about this. So I think it's being able to have the values of Filipinos and be able to mesh that all together so that we can heal and use psychology in a way that actually is cultivated and curated for our unique experience.
Did you want to go, Daniel, or should I go?
Sure. Well, I was going to echo you anyway about the intergenerational resilience. I used to provide, I still do provide trainings across the state with communities. And whenever I would do an intergenerational trauma training with a tribal community, there would always be a slide that specifically says surviving from intergenerational trauma requires intergenerational resilience. And I remind the people in the room as like, you're here because your ancestors were the strongest of the strong. They're the ones that were able to survive and thrive, and you are here and you carry all of that beauty, all of that strength with you. And then the way that people just sit up a little bit straighter after saying that, just, you know, just brings so much love into my heart. But we, part of breaking from the cycle of trauma is expressing emotions and thoughts in safe places with safe people. So if people don't even know that trauma exists, they won't even know that the resilience exists. So we have to name that in order to kind of move forward. There has to be acceptance of what has happened. I mean, if we look at what happened in the elections and basically this erasure of martial law, like, you know, only good vibes kind of thing. It's like, well, if it's only have good vibes, then we can't talk about what has happened and try and heal from that. So that erasure, that forced erasure of history is actually a way in which that we maintain that cycle of trauma. So it is important to name what is happening. And if we cannot move on, we cannot move on if we do not accept that atrocities have happened and have impacted our ancestors, impacted our parents, and continue to impact us. But one thing that's also important as folks kind of learn, you know, what has happened, what is happening, and there is a lot of reclamation that happens amongst diasporic Filipinos, is not to take what is not ours or yours. So there is this like reinforcing of colonial mentality and that product of genocide rooted in white supremacy, when some folks will claim specifically like indigenous Cordilleran or like Lumad kind of culture. It's like, I got this Filipino tattoo, it's Igorot, but they're not Igorot, and they don't really know what it comes from. So, you know, Asian American communities have been very outspoken about like, don't be getting characters or Sanskrit if that's not from you. But then a lot of people in our community do the same thing. And even though that feels like reclamation and healing, it is perpetuating the suffering of other folks. So how are we healing as a community? So that's kind of the individualistic side also. It's like, I'm healing, screw you. But it's like, no, we need to heal together. Part of the healing is the individual as well as the community healing. So, yep.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I mean, I can only share sort of my own, I think my own healing process. You know, I think growing up and into early adulthood, really there were very few, if I don't know that there were many at all, kind of Filipino mental health professionals, whether they were therapists or social workers. I mean, that was, an unfortunate fact of kind of my generation. And so for me, actually, initially, my healing process began, I think, with ethnic studies. So for those who aren't familiar with ethnic studies, um, California is the birthplace of ethnic studies, which arose out of this kind of activist movements in the late 1960s and 1970s. And Filipinos were very active in the fight for ethnic studies. And among the things that it did was create this field of study of ethnic studies, including Asian American studies, which allowed our stories to finally be told kind of in a college classroom. And that was a really initial important kind of process of my important first step for me in my own healing process. More recently, I, um, I suffered a really horrible loss in 2020 with the loss of my oldest son, who actually was working with indigenous communities in the Philippines. He had been inspired by their struggle and really wanted to learn from them and work alongside them. But, as part of my healing journey, I mean, I've been really blessed thankfully, there is a new generation of folks in the mental health space who are Filipino, or if not Filipino, BIPOC. That's Black, Indigenous, or people of color, which has been really helpful. So I was able to find a therapist who's Latina and actually grew up where I grew up, so I felt like she really understands who I am, where I come from. But I've also really turned to there's so many amazing Filipino healers who are trying to reclaim knowledges that actually had always been in their families, but had always been kind of devalued. Whether it's kind of knowledges around hilot as a form of kind of healing, to just other ways of kind of accessing our spirituality. And so I've worked with a whole bunch of really amazing Filipina healers who are trying to do this work, and who I think do work in responsible ways. Of course, it's hard. I think Daniel points out some real challenge when we go on this healing journey, that we don't want to also participate in reproducing kind of colonial logics in certain kinds of ways when we're trying to kind of reclaim maybe indigeneity in ways that might be kind of really harmful. But I've definitely worked with some amazing Filipino healers. And Adelina Teotico, who has surrendered healing, or Angela Angel, other ways of seeing healing. There's so many. Jeannie Celestial, just to kind of put a few names of people who've personally been very helpful for me. But also, to be honest, one thing for me is also just, and I think that's why I decided in my own process to kind of purchase this farm. I now have a farm, and I'm going to transition out of academia to do offer learning experiences out in nature. And so one of the things for me has been to be reconnected to the land and nature. We often talk about retail therapy, which I feel like is very much colonial. And what I found that is reconnecting to the earth, to the land, has been immensely healing for me, and kind of just being part of the process of growing things, being reminded of kind of the patience it takes to kind of attend to a young seedling, the satisfaction of sort of seeing it bear fruit. Also, understanding that it will kind of cycle again and again. And there's something incredibly healing about that. And so, I think that for me, that's also been a part of my own healing process. But I think it's ongoing. I don't know that we're ever finished, again, until really we're fully liberated, in a truly, genuinely decolonial world, which we're not very, but as we continue to do this work, I hope we get closer to it. But, I think that there are a range of ways that we're able to kind of connect, to just a more healed place. So, yeah, just from my own personal experiences.
All right. I have another member of FilExcellence here right next to me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I've been listening here just to the side and kind of looking at the chat here. I had a question, if you all don't mind. And we've talked about kind of moving through colonial mentality, through taking pride, through reclaiming knowledge. And I guess my question is, to take pride in the things even that you all are working on. So I would like to know, I would like to hear what you all are working on, and kind of uplifting that and providing some space for y'all to talk about that, if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, let's start with Daniel.
I am proud to be working with the Asian American Liberation Network here in Sacramento. We recently got some funding related to the Stop Asian Hate, and we're going to be doing some educational workshops, as well as providing short-term therapy for Asian American community members to deal with what has happened with COVID, as Dr. Kat pointed out. And the Wilson Center put out a great report about what impact it specifically had on Philam health workers. So I'm going to be part of that project. I'm part of a variety of things in Sacramento. I'm part of the Wilson Center's advisory board. So Shout out to the Bulasan Center, the Sacramento Filipinx LGBTQ organization. Talk about a part of our community who's still very much silenced in many ways. And just working in these spaces and doing these things, we get to see people in different parts of their healing journeys, but be with them in any part of that healing journey, right? So in certain ways, like the West is like, you're not here yet, well, you need to catch up. But, you know, with Dr. Katz said, the importance of our oral histories and telling stories, there are types of therapies that focus on just you sharing stories, something called narrative therapy, and with the focus of what you say and your worldview being how you heal, because you have all the tools that you need to heal, maybe some little things here and there, but you basically have that. So really, instead of like the other person as the expert, these committees and things that I serve on, it's the community that has that gift and that understanding and that knowledge, and we get that from each other. We are like basically the fire, and we keep it up by just kind of being around each other and sharing that knowledge.
Dr. Robyn?
Oh, there. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited, you know, that I've actually decided to retire early from my job in academia. You know, I've been able to do a lot in that space. My pride and joy was the creation of the Bulasan Center, which will continue to go on because it needs to exist in the university. Um, I just don't need to be in the university to help steer it. Plus, I wanted to create space for a new generation of folks to take on that work. But I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that, yes, we kind of did two things. I established a foundation in my late son's name, the Amado Kaya Foundation, which actually owns a retreat space that is meant to provide artists and community organizers who are aligned with the work that he did in the world in his short 22 years, a space of rest, a space of healing. So I'm very, very proud of that work. And in addition, I did purchase a farm with my husband. It's 8 acres. We have goats, baby goats on the way, and it's got a barn and lots of other spaces. And really, I hope that that's the place where I can help to support the ongoing healing work of our community, partnering with healers of all varieties, doing my kind of teaching, but being able to kind of offer education in a space outside of the institution. I'm super, super excited about that endeavor. You know how, I don't know if you ever feel this, but whenever I go to an Airbnb, I always think, damn, it'd be so dope if like we had something like this. Y'all, we have something like this. So I'm excited to share it out as we're kind of continuing to work on it. It's beautiful. There's a beautiful house there, lots of other space for camping, glamping. There's a pool, there's a hot tub, and all sorts of wonderful things. And yeah, we'll be doing hiking. And yes, yes, Dan, I'd love to collab on that with you to do kind of nature walks. It's amazing. I love it so much, and I'm really, really excited that you know, I took the step in that direction. It was a hard step, a scary step, but I think ultimately the right step. So proud to announce that, and thank you for giving me the space to talk about it.
I'm excited to see this farm come to life. We'll maybe visit it one of these days when you've all figured all the setup up. Like I said earlier, I'm much more earlier in my career than Daniel and Dr. Robyn. So right now I'm finishing my postdoc. But my hope is after getting licensed and everything is to open my own private practice. That's mostly geared to Asian American work. I've been doing a lot of clinical supervision with the younger generation. So to speak on the fact of like, there's not a lot of mental health clinicians who are well versed in Filipino American psychology. My hope in the future is to be able to create a private practice where I am able to nurture people from all ethnic backgrounds to be able to learn in this space about how to do Asian American psychology so that we can address the needs of the community. And then hopefully, my hope of hope is to have a group therapy for Filipino clients. But we're doing it one step at a time and getting that. But once I'm able to establish that, please feel free to find me. I would be happy to work with any of you who are welcoming therapy into your lives.
Wow. Oh my gosh. It doesn't feel real to be on this app among such amazing people. There was a question that came up from Instagram. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. How can we redefine our identity in America today? I guess we will start with
Give it to whoever wants it.
Actually, I will leave it open for whoever would like to answer.
So does identity need to be defined at any one point in time? From where is that idea that we must have a defined identity? Culture is not static. It is something that changes and flows, just like the ocean and the rivers and the lakes, right? So just because I liked and did something one way at a certain time does not mean that I will not later on. I used to not like pinapaitan, and now it is the greatest dish in all of the land, right next to Long Silog. So, our tastes change, our personalities change, our ideas change. So for you, the question asker and everyone else, it's about negotiating what you want to have in your life and what you see, and also to the point that we made earlier, making sure that on your journey you aren't perpetuating the harm of others while you try and define, redefine, or not define yourself.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I don't know if you were seeing our reactions while you were sharing that answer. Both Gian and me, at least, our mouths were like,
why do I want to cry? Like, after hearing that, it's like, what? I have to process that. I don't know what to do with that information. Man, that was a good one.
I love that. And I'm a virtual and in-person personal trainer, and that's something that I also share with clients, just I guess in my own personal life too, is like you're going to change and evolve, so your interests will evolve. So whatever you're doing right now is the right thing. Like if you're having fun, if you feel like you're being, I don't know, there's no wrong, I guess, way to do something, as long as it works for you. That's kind of what I share. So that's interesting. And I've also noticed, as my own observation, just in this journey of, I guess, reclaiming or rediscovering and unlearning, it manifests itself in the way that I coach and, go about my relationships. And that's a really cool. Now I'm also processing because I'm like, whoa, mind blown. But Dr. Robyn or Dr. Catherine, do you have anything to add onto that?
I don't know. That was pretty mind-blowing. So I don't know if we need to add any more to that. I'm going to leave it at what Daniel said, like props.
I do have a question for whoever wants to answer, because I know that this is my favorite topic, so I have you all here, so I'm going to talk about it. So with the colonial mentality, I know that when we talk about Filipinos, we always talk about how Filipinos are resilient. It's always that characteristic. But now that, we're reclaiming our culture and all of that, how would you encourage fellow Filipinos to basically, they don't have to be resilient all the time? How do we encourage our community to value, we do value our strength, but there's also strength in resting, there's strength in, taking care of ourselves. How do we take off that guilt from not being resilient all the time?
Dr. Robyn, I think you are muted still.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to take this one if that's okay. I mean, I think part of actually the resilience narrative, actually, I think is actually deeply part of the colonial mentality in its own way too. You know, it's funny. My own research actually, I wrote initially about why is it that Filipinos are working everywhere around the world, right? Why is it that we are the world's workers? And one of the things I discovered is the way that the Philippine government, and in many ways, they inherited this from even the Americans, really reproduced this idea of Filipinos as being kind of having a certain kind of character, and really resilience being one of those kinds of characteristics, as part of this kind of the commodification actually of our labor. And so I think we have it's a hard work, but it's important to discern when resilience and that term is being used in ways that are actually deeply implicated in kind of a colonial mentality, and when in fact it's speaking to something else that's maybe decolonial or anti-colonial. Um, and I would say, I think especially um, when we think about kind of, you talk about the rest or taking pause. I mean, the temporality of pause and rest is very antithetical to kind of Western thinking and really kind of this capitalist society we live in. And when and this is where I think land-based knowledges that we kind of inherit, kind of can get from our elders, is really important, because I think that the temporality of the land is very different. And especially when you do the work, and I'm new at this. I'm not really a farmer, but I think I've learned a lot just in the time that I've shifted in a relationship to the land in this way, that there's a different kind of temporality when you relate to the land. And so I guess the point just being that I think it's important to just sometimes be careful, because I do think that there are times when these terms get used in ways and co-opted in ways that mask their deeply colonial logics. And so I think that rest, taking pause, um, all of that is actually kind of very decolonial, and helps us on a pathway to healing. But it's also a very different way of thinking about resilience. So I think that's part of our challenge, right? Is how do we discern? Even self-care. I mean, self-care has become kind of an industry now, and we have to discern: is it at what point? Is that also colonial? Do we really? I mean, the industry of self-care, right? It's a proliferation of products that you have to consume. And then what? When you don't have access to the means to purchase them, therefore, you can't participate in self-care. These are things I think that require some interrogation sometimes. And that's sort of how I might answer that question. But thank you for it.
Did anybody else want to chime in? Thank you so much, Dr. Robyn. That was, to add on to that commodification of self-care, that is such a huge thing, because now we have this picture of what self-care might look like, when in reality self-care is just whatever the heck you want it to be, and whatever however you want to spend it. So I really like that point. I don't know if anybody else wanted to contribute.
I was just going to add, I love this idea, and I say this to my clients as well, is like rest is an act of resistance to all of the powers that make us say that our dignity as human beings relies on our productivity, which is, we all know, just capitalistic colonial nonsense that's embedded in us. And so if we can incorporate that more in our lives, it's in a way its own act, decolonialism, as Dr. Robyn has said. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned when you answered the question, which I hear a lot with my clients, is this idea of guilt, of feeling so guilty about taking time for ourselves and taking care of ourselves, and feeling, you have no idea how many times I've sat with a Filipino client and I have to say, like, it's okay not to be okay. When you're facing a global pandemic, when we're facing political strife, when we're facing another mass shooting again, and we're supposed to somehow be okay all the time because it's somehow inconvenient for capitalism for us not to be productive and not to have strength and not to keep going in the face of all of these atrocities. And so in the face of that, I say, like, you don't want to break and bend for yourself on a system that doesn't even like care that you're doing that. And so you need to learn to preserve yourself in the face of that so that you can keep going and you can create the change in which that you want to see in the world. And being able to rest so that we can create the dreams that we have. I feel like some people also struggle with that because one of the things a lot of my Filipino clients say is like, I'm being selfish taking a break. And it's like, you can't fill somebody else's cup and take care of somebody else when there's nothing for you to give. And so it's being also able to tap into this community that we create, right? Where it's one of the things I love about the Filipino culture is like, we are a community. We don't operate in this single individualistic space that Western ideals happen, but also at the same time, if you keep just pulling out from this bank of yours and you have nothing else to give, you're also degrading that spirit of yourself, and there's nothing more to give to community. And so rest is not only decolonization and resistance, it's also a way for us to be able to live closer to our ideals and our values as Filipino people.
I love that. I love thinking of rest as a constant resistance. When I'm laying on the couch, I'm just going to be like, I'm just resisting my colonial mentality right now. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, one thing that I say to clients is like, sometimes showing up means not showing up at all, because that's what you need. That's what your body needs. That's what your mind needs. But on that note, I guess if you had one thing to leave our audience with today, based off of our conversation, what would that be? Just final thoughts. Let's start with Daniel.
I would say my final thought would be to allow yourself to express emotions and thoughts in safe spaces with safe people. If you are looking for those safe spaces with safe people, email me, email us. This space sounds like a space where that is a safe space with safe people. If you don't want to explore alone, you shouldn't have to explore alone. So it's important to allow yourself to come up with these ideas and bring them up in a community that you feel safe in. And you might not feel safe at first, but know that, people's got your back.
I think we lost Dr. Robyn, so I'll go next. But I think the thing I want to impart is to take up space. Take up space even when the world is telling you to stay small and stay quiet and, go with the flow and not be trouble. Like, take up space where you show off your Filipino pride in your community. Take up space when you're going into therapy. A lot of people say, like, I'm not going to go to therapy because I don't want to burden somebody else. No, it's a space for you to talk and to share and to join in community and to heal. I think that's the other thing I'll leave with is we all deserve to heal. So give yourself the time and the space to be able to do that.
Let's just wrap.
Well, Thank you. um,
Next week.
Everybody, for joining this conversation tonight, wherever you are. When is the next Wellness Wednesday? I think we have a Wellness Wednesday next Wednesday at the same time. If you're still here, please join us. Daniel and Dr. Catherine, Dr. Robyn also. We really appreciate your time and for just educating us. I'm processing now, so I have not much to say to wrap up, but we look forward to just seeing all the things that you do for our community. We really appreciate everything that you do. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day or evening.
Thank you both so much. I hope to meet you one day.
Oh, thank you. Bye, everyone.